She hadn't touched another woman's baby in 6 months. Not since the funeral. Not since she packed away every tiny onesie and told herself she was done feeling anything at all. But when that baby's scream tore through the first-class cabin like a knife, Sarah Mitchell's body didn't ask for permission. Her chest ached. Her arms moved before her mind could stop them. And the man holding that child, the man with cold, dangerous eyes and a jaw carved from stone, looked up at her like she was either his salvation or his worst mistake. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The baby wouldn't stop. That was the only thought Dominic Santoro could hold on to as he sat in seat 1A of the transatlantic flight 40,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, with his newborn son screaming in his arms like the world was ending. And maybe it was. Maybe it had been ending for the last 11 days ever since Elena died on the table and left him with a child he didn't know how to hold, let alone love. He was not a man who panicked. He had sat across from federal prosecutors without blinking. He had watched men twice his size fall apart in front of him and felt nothing. He had buried his father, his brother, and two of his closest friends before the age of 42, and he had done all of it with his face perfectly, terrifyingly still. But Marco would not stop crying. "Sir," the flight attendant, a young woman with a practiced smile that was starting to crack at the edges, appeared at his elbow for the third time. "I've brought warm formula, just like you asked. Maybe if we try again." "I tried," Dominic said, and his voice was flat and controlled in the way that made people stop talking. "He won't take it." The flight attendant looked at the baby. She looked at Dominic. She took one small involuntary step backward. "Of course, I'll check with the galley. We might have—" "That's fine." He dismissed her with 2 words and turned back to his son. Marco was 11 days old. He weighed 6 pounds and 4 ounces. His face was red and crumpled and furious, and he looked in this moment nothing like Elena and everything like a small, devastated stranger. Dominic had been on this flight for 4 hours. In 4 hours, Marco had slept for maybe 30 minutes and spent the rest of the time announcing his misery to the entire cabin. 2 rows back behind the privacy partition, the other first-class passengers had gone very quiet. No one complained, no one said a word. Because they could feel, even if they couldn't name it, that the man holding that baby was not someone you complained to. His personal security, 2 men seated in the row across the aisle, hadn't moved in hours. They sat with their hands folded and their eyes forward and their expressions as readable as blank walls. Dominic bounced Marco gently the motion mechanical and learned from a YouTube video he had watched at 3 in the morning in a Rome hotel room while his son screamed at the ceiling. He had watched 14 videos in 11 days. He had read half a book about infant care before throwing it across the room because it kept using the word mother and he couldn't stop seeing Elena's face. "Shh," he said quietly. It wasn't tender. It wasn't soft. It was the voice of a man trying to negotiate with someone unreasonable. "Marco, enough." Marco did not find this convincing. 2 seats behind the partition in 3, Sarah Mitchell pressed her forehead against the cold window and tried to breathe. She had been doing that a lot lately, just breathing, reminding herself that breathing was still something she knew how to do, even when everything else had become uncertain and strange. She was 38 years old, a nurse of 12 years, a mother for 8 months, and then not. Just like that. Not. Chloe had been born too small and too early and had fought with everything she had for 8 weeks in the NICU before she stopped fighting. That had been 6 months ago. Sarah had gone back to work after 3 months because sitting in her apartment alone was worse than anything a hospital floor could throw at her. She had requested the Rome assignment, a short-term nursing consultation gig, with a private clinic because she needed to be somewhere that wasn't home, somewhere that didn't have a drawer full of tiny socks she couldn't bring herself to donate. She was going back now. Back to Chicago, back to her apartment and the drawer full of socks and the life she was supposed to be rebuilding. And then the baby started crying. It hit her before she could prepare for it. Not the sound exactly. She had worked in pediatrics. She had heard babies cry in every register and frequency known to medicine, but something about this particular cry, the desperation in it, the absolute raw need reached through all her professional training and grabbed her somewhere older and more animal. Her body responded before her brain did. She felt a familiar, painful tightening in her chest that she still wasn't used to even 6 months out. Her milk had never fully dried up. The doctors said it would eventually. It hadn't yet. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum and told herself to look away. Look at the window. Look at the darkness outside. Don't listen. Don't be a nurse right now. Be a passenger. Be anonymous. Be nobody. The baby screamed. She closed her eyes. The baby screamed again, and this time there was something different in it, not just hunger, not just discomfort, but a quality of pure exhausted despair that made Sarah's throat close up. She had heard that cry in the NICU. She had heard it in the quiet hours of the night when a baby was past the point of expecting comfort and was simply announcing its loneliness to the universe. She stood up before she made a conscious decision to stand. She was in the aisle before she realized she was moving. Her feet took her past the partition. Her hands smoothed the front of her cardigan in a gesture so automatic it might as well have been programmed. And then she was standing in the small, pressurized world of first class, looking at a man she had never seen before, who was holding a very small, very distressed infant with the careful desperation of someone who had been taught the mechanics of a thing, but not the soul of it. He looked up. His eyes were dark. Not brown, darker than brown, like something had burned out the warmth in them a long time ago. He was handsome in the way that expensive things are sometimes handsome, precise and deliberate, with a quality of danger underneath it that you felt before you named it. He was wearing a suit that cost more than Sarah's monthly rent and holding a newborn like it was a grenade he didn't know how to defuse. "I'm a nurse," Sarah said, and her voice was steadier than she expected. "Can I help?" The two men across the aisle were suddenly very alert. She felt it more than saw it, a shift in their posture, a sharpening of attention. Like guard dogs who hadn't decided whether to bark yet. The man with the dark eyes looked at her for a long moment. He was assessing her. She had been assessed by difficult patients before, by frightened families, by people who decided in the first 3 seconds whether they were going to trust you or make your life impossible. She held his gaze and kept her breathing even. "He won't eat," the man said finally. His voice had an accent she couldn't immediately place, Italian, maybe worn smooth by years of American English. "The formula, he won't take it." "How old is he?" 11 days. Sarah's stomach clenched. 11 days, born and then put on a transatlantic flight. She kept her expression neutral with the practice of a decade of professional composure. "Where's his mother?" Something happened in the man's face. It was brief, a single unguarded second, but she caught it. The way the jaw tightened, the way something behind his eyes went utterly, completely still. "She's not here," he said, and that was everything all at once. Sarah understood in the way that nurses learn to understand, not from words, but from the spaces around them. She felt the loss coming off him like cold air. "Okay," she said quietly. She sat down in the empty seat beside him. The other men leaned forward slightly, and she ignored them and held out her hands. "May I?" He didn't move for a moment. Then slowly, carefully, like he was handing over something irreplaceable, he transferred Marco into her arms. The baby was warm and solid and impossibly small. He was still crying, but when Sarah settled him against her chest and curled her arm around him in the practiced way she had done hundreds of times, he paused for just 1 second. 1 second of surprised silence. "Hi," she said softly. "Hi, sweetheart. I've got you." Marco looked up at her with the unfocused, ancient gaze of a newborn, and his lower lip trembled, and he started crying again. But it was different now, less desperate, like he'd been heard. "He needs to be fed," Sarah said, and kept her voice clinical and calm. "The formula might be the wrong temperature, or the wrong flow rate from the nipple, or he might be overtired and overstimulated to latch properly to a bottle. All of those are fixable." She paused. She looked down at Marco. She had not intended to say the next thing. But it was true, and she was a nurse, and the truth was usually more useful than the comfortable silence. "He might also just need something the formula can't give him right now." The man went very still. "What does that mean?" Sarah met his eyes. "I can still feed him myself," she said, and the words cost her something. She felt it in her chest, a small, sharp pain, like pressing on a bruise. "I know that's an unusual offer from a stranger. You don't know me, but he's hungry and distressed and 11 days old, and I can help him if you'll let me." The silence that followed was the loudest silence she had ever sat inside. The two men across the aisle exchanged a look that she absolutely could not read. The man beside her, Dominic, though she didn't know his name yet, stared at her with those dark, burned-out eyes, and she watched something move behind them. Not calculation exactly, or not only calculation. Something more human than that. "Why would you do that?" he asked. It was not a hostile question. It was genuine, almost bewildered, the question of a man who had spent so long in a world where nobody did anything without an angle that simple generosity had become incomprehensible to him. Sarah looked down at Marco again. "Because he's crying," she said simply, "and I can make him stop." Another long moment. Then, "What's your name?" Where Sarah Mitchell. "Dominic." He didn't offer a last name. "And he's Marco." She nodded. She looked at him steadily. "Dominic, your son needs to eat. Will you let me help him?" He looked at her for 3 more seconds that felt like 3 hours. Then he nodded once, a single decisive motion, like a man who had weighed an impossible thing and decided. She turned slightly in her seat, adjusting her cardigan, moving with the practiced, unself-conscious efficiency of a medical professional, and Marco, as if he understood that something important was happening, quieted to a small hitching whimper. When she brought him to her, he latched immediately, instinctively, with the blind, powerful drive of a creature who has been waiting for exactly this. The cabin went silent, not the hell-breath silence of before. Something different, softer. Dominic Santoro, who had not cried in 11 days, who had not cried, he suspected, in something closer to 11 years, pressed his fist against his mouth and turned to look at the window. His reflection looked back at him, hollow-eyed and raw, and he stayed very still until he was sure of his face again. Sarah looked down at the baby in her arms and felt something she hadn't felt in 6 months. Not happiness. It was too complicated and too painful to be simply happiness. But something. A warmth in the chest that didn't hurt. A sense of use, of purpose, of her body doing what it was built for a child who needed it. "Chloe," she thought, I'm sorry this isn't you. But I'm glad I can do this for someone." She breathed slowly and kept her eyes on Marco, and didn't let herself think too hard about the man beside her, who had gone very quiet in a way that felt somehow more vulnerable than anything she had seen in a long time. It was the flight attendant who broke the silence, reappearing with a tentative smile and a glass of water that she set carefully on Dominic's tray table without making eye contact with anyone. The two men across the aisle had settled back into their stillness, but it was a different stillness now, watchful, rather than coiled. "He's eating," said one of them low. Not quite to Dominic, not quite to anyone. "I can see that," Dominic said, and his voice was rough in a way that it hadn't been before. When Marco finished full and warm and deeply finally asleep, Sarah handed him back with the same careful efficiency with which she had taken him. Dominic received his son and held him against his chest, and the way he sat there perfectly still, one large hand spread across the baby's tiny back, was the most unguarded thing she had seen from him yet. "Thank you," he said. He said it to the window. "He needs to eat every 2 to 3 hours." Sarah said, nurse voice again, building herself a small professional wall to stand behind. "He might do better with a slower flow nipple on the bottle, and the cabin is probably overstimulating for him. If you can keep the light low and the noise down around him, he'll sleep more easily." "I know." He paused. "I mean, I read that. I'm not very good at this." It was the most ordinary sentence he had said, and it was the one that got through all her professional composure without asking permission. She heard the exhaustion in it, the grief, the terrifying, specific helplessness of a person who has controlled every room they have ever walked into, being completely undone by 6 pounds of sleeping infant. "Nobody is at first," she said. "Oh, I am." He turned to look at her then, not the assessment from before, not the weighing of angles and intentions, just looking, like he was trying to figure out what kind of person she was. "Where are you flying to?" he asked. "Chicago, New York. We connect in Chicago." She nodded. Marco made a small sound in his sleep, and Dominic's hand tightened slightly on his back in a reflex that was purely, entirely protective. They didn't speak for a while after that. The cabin settled back into its nighttime hush. Sarah returned to her seat and sat with her hands in her lap and stared at nothing and breathed in and out. She thought about Chloe. She thought about Dominic's face when she had asked about the baby's mother. She thought about the way Marco had latched as if she were the answer to a question he'd been asking since he was born. She was 40 minutes into not thinking too hard about any of it when the flight attendant appeared at her elbow with a note folded once on heavy cream paper. "From the gentleman in 1A, the woman said, and quickly moved on. Sarah opened it. It said in handwriting that was precise and slightly stiff, like someone who had learned penmanship under strict instruction. "If you're willing, I would like to ask you something when you have a moment. No obligation. D." She read it twice. She folded it back up. She put it in her cardigan pocket and sat with it against her ribs for a long moment. Then she stood up and walked back to 1A. Dominic was awake. She suspected he hadn't slept at all, and Marco was asleep in what looked like a purpose-built carry seat strapped carefully to the seat beside him. He stood when she approached, which she hadn't expected, a reflex of old-fashioned courtesy that felt entirely at odds with everything else about him. "Sit down," she said. "You look exhausted." He sat. She took the seat across from him. His men were somewhere behind the partition, now she realized moved to give them privacy, which struck her as an oddly choreographed thing. "What did you want to ask me?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at Marco. Then he said carefully and directly, in the way of a man who does not soften things because he hasn't learned how, "I need someone to help with him. Not a nanny, not staff. I've had 2 nannies in 11 days, good women, both of them highly recommended, and he screamed through every hour they were with him. He stopped. He looked at her. He needs what you just gave him." Sarah's breath caught. "Dominic, I'm a stranger on a plane." "I know that. I have a job. I have a life in Chicago. I'm not asking you to abandon it." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm asking if you would be willing to come to New York for a few weeks to help him transition to a bottle properly, or however long he needs. You'd be compensated, more than fairly." A pause. "And I know this is a strange thing to ask. I know I'm asking it strangely. But I've been awake for 11 days and my son is 11 days old and I don't—" He stopped again. Something moved across his face, quickly controlled. "I don't know how to do this without help." There were a lot of things Sarah could have said. She could have said no, the sensible, obvious, self-protective thing. She could have said she was sorry, and she hoped he found what he needed, and she was glad she could help on the flight. She could have said any number of reasonable things that would have ended this conversation cleanly and left her on the plane to Chicago with her sorrow and her drawer full of socks. Instead, she heard herself say, "Tell me about his mother." Dominic went completely still. "I'm not asking to pry," she said quickly. "I'm asking because he's 11 days old and already grieving something, and I think you are too. And if I'm going to help a child, I need to understand what he's living inside." For a long moment, she thought she had gone too far. The men hadn't come back, but she could feel them somehow just beyond the partition. She felt the weight of Dominic's stillness as something physical. Then he said very quietly, "Elena, her name was Elena. She died 11 days ago. Complications. After he was born." He looked at his hands. His jaw worked once. She never held him. Sarah felt the grief rise in her own throat and held it there. "I'm so sorry," she said. "She would have known what to do," he said, still looking at his hands. "She always knew what to do. She would have—" He stopped. He looked up and his eyes were dry, but the pain in them was the kind that goes too deep for tears. "She would have loved him so completely that it wouldn't have mattered that I didn't know what I was doing." Sarah looked at the sleeping baby in the carry seat. "She thought I know what it is to lose a child. She thought he is trying so hard to love his son, and grief keeps getting in the way. She thought 6 months ago someone offered me a cup of tea in the hospital corridor, and I cried for 20 minutes because of the simple human kindness of it. 'I'll come to New York,' she said." She hadn't decided it. Her mouth had decided it without consulting her. But when she heard it out loud, it didn't feel wrong. Dominic looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "I need to know one thing first," she said, and kept her voice steady. "Who are you? I mean, who are you really? Not just the name. Because those men aren't your cousins, and that suit costs more than most people make in a year, and you flew first class with a newborn and a security detail, and you're asking a stranger to move into your house." She met his eyes. "So who are you?" The pause that followed was the longest yet. In the carry seat, Marco sighed in his sleep, a small, satisfied sound, and his tiny fist curled tighter against his chest. Dominic looked at his son for a moment. Then he looked at Sarah. My family, he said slowly, has certain business interests. We have for 3 generations. The business is, he paused, complicated, and I've been trying for the past several years to make it less so, to move away from some of it. Another pause. There are people who don't want me to succeed in that, and so Marco and anyone close to him would need to be protected. He looked at her steadily. I'm telling you this because you asked honestly, and I don't want you to come to New York and then learn it on your own and feel deceived. Sarah held very still. She was a nurse. She had worked emergency rooms in Chicago. She was not naive about the world and the things people did in it. She heard what he was saying underneath what he was saying, and she understood it, and a very sensible part of her was suggesting loudly that this was the moment to politely decline and return to her seat. How complicated, she said. His eyes didn't waver. Complicated enough that I'm the one asking you instead of telling you. I know the difference matters. Something in that landed solidly somewhere inside her. She looked at Marco. She looked at Dominic. I'll need to make some calls, she said, and I'll need to be able to leave if I decide I need to leave. That has to be clear. It's clear, he said immediately. You are not a prisoner. You are never a prisoner. If you want to leave, you leave. I will arrange it personally. She nodded slowly. She looked back at the window at the darkness outside and the thin ribbon of cloud and the possible distance between here and where they had both started. Okay, she said, and Marco, still asleep, made a small sound that might have been contentment, and the plane flew on through the dark. The car was waiting on the tarmac. Not at the gate, not in the regular flow of passengers and luggage and the ordinary chaos of an international arrival. On the tarmac directly beside the plane, a black SUV with tinted windows and 2 men standing beside it with the careful stillness of people who have learned that stillness is a form of power. Sarah stepped off the jet bridge and saw them and felt the first real understanding of what she had agreed to settle into her stomach like a stone dropping into cold water. She had made her calls during the last 2 hours of the flight. Her supervisor at the hospital, who had been encouraging her to take more time anyway, and sounded almost relieved. Her friend Dana in Chicago, who had listened to the entire story in silence, and then said, Sarah, listen to me. This man is either a saint or a mobster, and from what you're describing, it is definitely one of those 2 things. Sarah had actually laughed, the first real laugh in longer than she could remember, and said she thought Dana was probably right. Dana had said, call me every day, no, twice a day, and if you stop calling, I'm going to the FBI. Sarah had said, deal. She had not told Dana about how Marco had felt in her arms. She hadn't told anyone that. Some things were too raw and too private to say out loud yet. Dominic moved through the airport with the efficiency of a man who has never once waited in a line in his life. Not arrogantly, there was nothing showy about it. It was more like gravity. People simply moved. Doors simply opened. The 2 men from the plane had become 4, and they arranged themselves around Dominic and the baby carrier with a precision that felt practiced and permanent. Sarah walked beside him and told herself she was just a nurse, a professional. This was a job. You're quiet, Dominic said without looking at her. I'm processing, she said. That's fair. The car on the tarmac, she said. Standard. For who? He glanced at her sideways and something almost like amusement crossed his face, brief and quickly gone like sunlight through a fast-moving cloud. For me, he said simply. She let that sit. Marco was in the carrier on Dominic's chest, still sleeping with the profound commitment of a newborn who has finally eaten enough. His small dark head was tucked under Dominic's chin, and the image of it, this man who moved through the world like a controlled explosion, carrying his 11-day-old son against his heart, kept snagging at something inside her that she didn't have language for yet. The SUV took them to a building in Manhattan that didn't announce itself. No doorman in a uniform, no lobby full of flowers and mirrors. Just a Dora key code and an elevator that opened directly into an apartment on the 14th floor. And then she walked in and she understood something new about the kind of money she was dealing with. She didn't look at the apartment. She looked at the woman standing in the center of it. She was older, 70 maybe, with silver hair pulled back sharply and eyes the same dark color as Dominic's. She was holding a dish towel, as if she'd been caught in the middle of something domestic. But there was nothing domestic about the way she was looking at Sarah. It was the look of someone deciding something before they've heard all the evidence. Zia Rosa, Dominic said, and there was something in his voice, not quite warning, not quite affection, something caught between. This is Sarah Mitchell, the nurse I told you about. The nurse from the airplane, the woman said. Her accent was thicker than Dominic's, the Italian underneath it closer to the surface. The one who fed my nephew's child on a plane with her own body. Sarah felt heat rise in her face and held it down with effort. I'm a nurse, she said steadily. It was a medical decision. Zia Rosa looked at her for another long moment, then looked at Marco, still sleeping against Dominic's chest. Her face changed when she looked at the baby. Something in it softened and broke open all at once, and she was across the room before Sarah had processed the movement, her hand cupping the back of Marco's head with a tenderness so fierce it was almost violent. My Elena's boy, she said softly in Italian, and then caught herself and looked up at Dominic with eyes that were bright and not quite dry. He ate, Dominic said. Zia Rosa looked at Sarah again. The assessment had shifted into something else, not warm exactly, but different, considering. You'll stay in the East Room, she said. I made up the bed this morning. She turned and walked back toward the kitchen without waiting for a response. Sarah looked at Dominic. She knew I was coming. I called ahead. From the plane. From the plane. She absorbed that. He had called ahead before she had even agreed to come, and she should probably find that unsettling. And she did find it a little unsettling, but she also understood it. He was a man who moved in the direction of what he needed and trusted the details to sort themselves out. She had met people like that before. Usually in ICS, making impossible decisions about loved ones. The ruthlessness and the love were always tangled up together. I want to be clear about something, she said. He turned to look at her. I'm here for Marco, she said. I'm going to help him establish a proper feeding routine and work on bottle acceptance and get him sleeping in longer stretches. That's the job. And when he's stable and thriving, I'm going back to Chicago. That's not negotiable. Dominic held her gaze. Understood, he said. And I need to be able to move freely in this building. I'm not going to be managed. Something flickered. You're not going to be managed, he said. You have my word. Okay, she said. She looked at Marco. Let me wash my hands, and then I want to do a proper assessment of him. Weight, color, hydration. And I want to look at what formula you've been using and how you've been preparing it, because I want to know if the bottle issue is mechanical or behavioral. Dominic blinked. It was the first time she had seen him look genuinely taken aback. All right, he said, and you need to sleep, she added. I can see the exhaustion from here. You're no good to him if you collapse. She moved past him toward the hallway Zia Rosa had disappeared down. Which room is mine? There was a pause. Then second on the left. She nodded and kept walking. Behind her, she heard Dominic say something quiet, and one of the men responded, and then there was the sound of the elevator. She didn't look back. In her room with the door closed and her bag on the floor, she sat on the edge of the bed and shook for about 30 seconds. Not dramatically, just the fine internal trembling of a person who has been holding themselves together by will and professionalism and has finally found a moment to acknowledge that they are slightly terrified. She had just moved into the home of a man she had met 9 hours ago on an airplane. A man she was not naive, she was not going to be naive about this, almost certainly done things in his life that a court would be very interested in. She was here because of a baby, because of the way a child had latched onto her like she was the answer to a question, and because of the look on a grief-destroyed man's face when his son finally stopped crying. She took 3 slow breaths. Then she stood up, found the bathroom, washed her hands, and went to assess Marco. He was awake by then, just barely blinking at the world, with the unfocused ancient gaze of the very new, and when Sarah laid him on the changing table and ran through her assessment with the practiced efficiency of an ICU nurse, he watched her face with an attention that felt, however irrationally, like recognition. He was slightly underweight for 11 days, but not alarmingly so. He was hydrated, his color was good, his reflexes were normal. He was a healthy baby boy who had spent the first 11 days of his life in the care of a man who loved him desperately and competently didn't know what he was doing. He's okay, she told Dominic, who had been standing in the doorway the entire time she worked, not interfering, just watching. He's going to be okay. The breath that came out of Dominic, then she felt it more than heard it, like something had been holding itself compressed and was finally released. It was Zia Rosa who first let something slip. She did it over dinner, a meal she had assembled with the focused intensity of a woman who solves problems through cooking, when Dominic had stepped out to take a call, and it was just the two of them at the kitchen table with Marco and his bassinet between them. "You know what this family is," Zia Rosa said. "Not a question." "I have a general idea," Sarah said carefully. "Dominic has been trying to step back for 3 years," the older woman said, and her voice was low and measured, like someone choosing which pieces of information to move and which to leave in place. "Since he met Elena, she was not from this world. She was a teacher. Did he tell you that?" "No." "Elementary school, 3rd grade." Zia Rosa looked down at her hands. "She knew who he was when she married him. She wasn't stupid. But she made him promise that by the time their child was born, there would be a clean line, a real one. That the business he couldn't walk away from in a day, he would be walking away from by the end." She paused. "Elena died before she could see whether he'd keep it." Sarah was quiet because she understood that silence was required here. "There are people," Zia Rosa continued even more quietly, "who do not want him to keep that promise, who have reasons to keep him bound to what he's trying to leave. And a man grieving his wife alone with a newborn." She looked up at Sarah. "A man like that is vulnerable in ways he has never been vulnerable before, and the people who depend on that vulnerability are watching." The air in the room changed. "Are you telling me I need to be careful?" Sarah said. "I'm telling you," Zia Rosa said with a directness that reminded Sarah forcibly of her own grandmother, "that you walked into the middle of something you don't fully understand, and I am telling you this not to frighten you away." She looked at Marco sleeping in the bassinet, his tiny chest rising and falling in its perfect, steady rhythm. "I am telling you because you are the first person since Elena died who has made my nephew's son stop crying. And in this family, that means something." Sarah stared at the old woman. "What does it mean?" Zia Rosa picked up her fork. "It means," she said, "that you should be very certain of your answer before anyone asks you to leave." The question Sarah was about to ask died in her throat when Dominic came back into the room. He looked at both of them, reading the atmosphere with the quick, practiced skill of a man who has survived by noticing things. "What did I miss?" he said. "Nothing," said Zia Rosa pleasantly. "Sit down and eat." He sat. He looked at Sarah. She looked back at him and kept her expression even, and thought, what has this man gotten me into? The first night was uneventful in the ways that mattered, and completely sleepless in the ways that were expected. Marco woke every 2.5 hours, and Sarah handled the 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock feedings herself, working steadily to coax him toward the bottle, with the slow patience of someone who knows that trust, even in infants, is built in small increments. Dominic appeared at the doorway at the 2 o'clock feeding without being called, and she looked up at him and said, "Go back to bed." And he said, "I can't sleep." And she said, "Then sit down and be quiet." And he did. They sat together in the low light, her working with Marco, him watching, and didn't speak for almost 20 minutes. It should have been awkward. It wasn't. "Can I ask you something?" Dominic said finally quietly. Why did you really say yes on the plane? Why did you actually agree?" She was quiet for a moment, looking down at Marco. "Because I lost a baby," she said, 6 months ago. She was 8 weeks old. And for 6 months, I've been walking around feeling like my body doesn't know she's gone, like it's still waiting to be useful to someone." She kept her eyes on Marco. "And on that plane, when he was crying, my body knew what to do before I did. And I hadn't felt that certainty, that usefulness in a really long time." She paused. "So I said yes, because I needed this too, not just him." The silence that followed was the kind that fills itself. "I'm sorry," Dominic said, "about your daughter. Her name was Chloe." "Chloe," he repeated quietly, like it was something worth honoring. Marco, settled and milk-warm and deeply content, let out a small, extravagant sigh and went completely limp in Sarah's arms. She looked down at him and felt the complicated, painful, beautiful feeling she still didn't have a name for move through her chest. "He's asleep," she said. "I know." Dominic didn't move. "Thank you, Sarah." She looked up at him, really looked for the first time in hours without the nurse's professional remove. He was tired in a way that went deeper than sleep could fix, and his eyes were raw, and he was sitting in a chair at 4 in the morning in his own home watching a stranger care for his son, because there was no one else, and the courage of that, the sheer, quiet, unsentimental courage of a man choosing to be helped rather than pretend he wasn't drowning, hit her somewhere she wasn't prepared for. "Get some sleep," she said softly. "I'll be here when he wakes up." He stood. He paused in the doorway for just a moment. "In the morning," he said, "there's something I need to tell you about the situation here. Something you should know before—" He stopped. She looked at him steadily. "Tell me now." "What, tonight?" His voice was firm, but not unkind. "Tonight, Marco is asleep, and you're exhausted, and I'm—" He stopped again. "In the morning, I promise." She watched him go. She looked down at Marco. She thought about what Zia Rosa had said, that she had walked into the middle of something she didn't fully understand, and she thought about the way Dominic had said, "There's something you should know," with that particular careful weight in his voice. She settled Marco into his bassinet. She sat back in the chair. She did not sleep. By the time the first gray light came through the window, she had decided two things. The first was that she was staying at least for now. The second was that whatever Dominic was about to tell her in the morning, she was going to need every bit of the steadiness that 12 years of nursing had built in her. She was right about that. She just didn't know yet how badly she was going to need it. Dominic was already awake when she came out of Marco's room at 6:15 in the morning. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. He hadn't touched his phone, face down in front of him, and the particular stillness of a man who has been sitting with a difficult thing for long enough that it has started to feel like furniture. He looked up when she walked in. He looked at Marco bundled against her shoulder, and something in his face eased by a fraction. "He slept 4 hours straight," Sarah said quietly, "after the 4 o'clock feeding." "That's progress." "Good." He stood and poured her a cup of coffee without asking, which she noted, and set it on the table, and she sat down across from him because she could feel the weight of what he had promised to tell her sitting between them like a third person. "Say it," she said. He looked at his hands, then at her. "3 weeks ago," he said, "a man named Victor Callo made a formal claim on the leadership of the Santoro family. He's been working toward it for 2 years, building alliances, moving money, repositioning loyalties. He chose the timing deliberately." A pause. "He waited until Elena was in the hospital. Until I was distracted." Sarah held very still. Marco stirred against her shoulder, and she moved her hand to his back, automatically steadying him. "He's not going to move openly," Dominic continued. "That's not how this is done. He'll use leverage. He'll use the people close to me. He'll find the edges of my life and press on them until something gives." He looked at her directly. "I'm telling you this because you are now, whether either of us intended it, one of those edges. You're in my home. You're caring for my son. And if Callo's people have been watching, and they have been watching, they already know who you are." The coffee cup was warm in her hands, and the apartment was quiet, and Marco was breathing steadily against her shoulder. And Sarah Mitchell, who had thought she was coming to New York to help a baby eat, understood in one clean, clarifying moment that she had walked into something considerably larger than that. "How much danger?" she said, not hysterically, clinically. "I don't know yet," he said, and she appreciated that he didn't dress it up. "Callo doesn't hurt civilians without reason, but he'll use them, apply pressure. He might approach you directly, offer you money to leave or to report back to him about my movements. He might try to frighten you." He paused. "If anyone contacts you, anyone who isn't me or Rosa or my men, I need you to tell me immediately." "Okay," she said. He blinked. "Okay. What would you prefer, screaming?" She looked at him steadily. "I spent 6 years working emergency trauma. I've had patients grab my wrist hard enough to bruise it. I've had family members threaten me in waiting rooms. I don't panic easily." She shifted Marco gently. "Tell me what I need to know to keep him safe, and I'll do it." Dominic stared at her for a moment in a way that suggested he was recalibrating something. Then he said, "Don't leave the building without telling me or one of my men first. Don't speak to anyone in the lobby you haven't met through me. And don't—" He stopped. "Don't underestimate how much Marco's existence complicates things for Callo. A healthy heir changes the inheritance calculation. It changes everything." Sarah looked down at Marco, this sleeping 6-pound, 4-ounce person who had changed everything just by arriving in the world. He's why Callow is moving now, she said slowly. He waited until after the baby was born. Yes, because as long as Elena was pregnant, harming her was off the table even for Callow. Too much blowback. But now she stopped. She heard herself think it out, and it was cold and clear and awful. Now it's just a newborn with no mother and a father who's grieving and distracted. Yes, Dominic said again. His voice was very quiet. Marco made a small sound and turned his face into Sarah's neck, and she felt the warmth of his breath and the solidity of his small body, and something in her went absolutely implacably certain. She had lost one child she couldn't save. She was not going to lose this one to negligence or ignorance or fear. All right, she said, I need you to tell your men that I have full access to every room in this apartment. No exceptions. If I'm going to be aware of the security situation, I need to be able to move freely within it. Dominic nodded once. Done. And I need a secure phone. Mine is on an open carrier, and if Callow's people are already watching, it's already compromised. He looked at her with an expression that was half surprise and half something that might in a different man have been called admiration. He said nothing. He reached into his jacket and slid a phone across the table. Already set up, he said. My number is the first contact. She picked it up. You were going to give me this anyway. I was hoping you'd ask for it. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked away because the look in his eyes was too direct and she wasn't ready for whatever it meant. I want to be useful here, she said carefully. Not managed, not protected, like something fragile, useful. Do you understand the difference? Yes, he said immediately, and then with a quality of honesty that hit harder than she expected. Elena said almost exactly that to me once, 2 months after we met. He paused. I wasn't very good at it with her in the beginning. I'm trying to do better. The sentence landed in the space between them and stayed there. Sarah looked at her coffee. Tell me about her, she said. While you eat something, you haven't eaten, I can tell. She nodded toward the counter where Rosa had left bread and fruit from the night before. Eat, talk. It's good for you to talk about her. He looked momentarily confused by being given instructions in his own kitchen. Then he got up and cut bread and sat back down and said haltingly at first and then with more ease that Elena had grown up in a suburb of Milan and had been teaching in New York for 4 years. When he met her at a benefit dinner he had attended for appearances, and she had attended because 3 of her students' families were beneficiaries of the scholarship it supported. She had known who he was by the second conversation. She had told him on their 3rd date with perfect composure that she was not interested in being part of his world, but was very interested in him specifically, and that he would need to decide which of those 2 things mattered more. She gave me 6 months, he said, to start making it real, not just promising, actually doing the work of getting out. And Sarah said, and I was doing it. Slowly. It's not a light switch. There are obligations. There are people who depend on. He stopped. There are things that take time to untangle, but I was doing it. Elena could see I was doing it. He looked at his hands again. She got pregnant, and I thought we were going to make it. I thought we were going to get all the way out and raise Marco in a completely different kind of life. Sarah was quiet. And then the delivery went wrong, he said simply. And she was gone, and Marco was here, and he stopped for a long time. I was standing in a hospital corridor holding a 6-pound baby thinking the one person who made any of this worth doing is dead, and now I have to do it for him, and I didn't know how. Marco, as if he had been listening, chose this moment to wake up. He announced it in the usual manner, a small escalating series of sounds that went from whimper to full complaint in about 8 seconds, and Sarah stood immediately and began the familiar, practiced work of settling him, and Dominic watched her do it with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not just gratitude, something more complicated, something that looked a little like watching someone carry a thing he had been carrying alone for too long. The morning passed in the focused rhythm of infant care feedings and burpings and the careful incremental work of teaching Marco that the bottle and the warmth behind it were the same comfort in different forms. By noon, he had taken 2 full feeds from the bottle, which was a victory. Sarah reported to Dominic with genuine satisfaction, and Dominic had responded with a relief so physical, she watched his shoulders drop 2 full inches. Zia Rosa watched all of it with her sharp assessing eyes and said very little, which Sarah was beginning to understand was its own form of approval. It was at 2 in the afternoon that the first real complication arrived. It came in the form of a knock at the apartment door, not the elevator, the actual door, and the way Dominic's two visible men went instantly, silently alert, told Sarah everything she needed to know about how unexpected that knock was. Dominic was on his feet before the second knock. He looked at Sarah. "Take Marco to the East Room," he said. His voice was low and absolutely controlled. "Stay there until I come for you." She didn't argue. She took Marco and moved. Through the closed door, she heard voices. Dominic's low and clipped, and another voice she didn't recognize, male with a pleasantness in it that felt like a knife held in a relaxed hand. She couldn't make out words. She pressed Marco closer and felt his heartbeat against her chest, steady and oblivious, and made herself breathe. It lasted 7 minutes. She counted. When Dominic came to the door, he opened it and looked at her and Marco, and something in his face was very controlled in the particular way that meant he was angry. "Who was it?" she said. "A message," he said, "from Callow." He paused. "He knows you're here. He knows your name, your hospital in Chicago, your friend Dana's address." He said it flat and direct, the way she'd asked him to treat her, and she felt the cold of it go through her before she stabilized. "He wants you to know that leaving would be the smart choice." Sarah looked at him. Her hands were completely steady. "What does that mean? What happens to Dana if I stay?" "Nothing," he said immediately, and the certainty in his voice was not reassurance, it was a statement of fact. "I've already made calls. Dana has 2 men outside her building as of 20 minutes from now. She won't see them. She won't know they're there. But they're there." Sarah stared at him. "You in the middle of that conversation you arranged." "I made the call while he was still talking to my man at the door," he said simply. "I wasn't going to let you worry about that." She didn't know what to say. She stood there with Marco against her shoulder, and the cold of the threat still sitting in her chest, and the warmth of this man's completely matter-of-fact protection of someone he had never met. Her friend, her only family left in Chicago, and felt something move through her that was too tangled and too new to name. "You should have told me he was coming," she said, because she needed to say something practical. "I didn't know he was coming. That's the point. He came to show me he could." Dominic's jaw was tight. It was theater. It means he doesn't have anything concrete yet, so he's trying intimidation. "And what do you do about theater?" "You don't react to it," he said. "You make clear it didn't work, and you go about your day." He wants me rattled. He wants me to make a decision from fear instead of strategy. His eyes met hers. "I'm not afraid of Victor Callow. I'm annoyed by him." Despite everything, something in her almost wanted to smile at the absolute flatness of that. "You're annoyingly calm about this." "I've had practice." Marco, entirely indifferent to organized crime, chose this moment to produce an opinion about his diaper loudly and without diplomacy. Sarah looked down at him and then back up at Dominic and said, "We'll continue this conversation in a minute," and turned to deal with the immediate situation. She heard Dominic exhale behind her. Not quite a laugh. Not a laugh. By evening, the apartment had settled into a fragile normalcy. Rosa made dinner. Marco slept in 2-hour stretches, which was improvement. Dominic took a call after dinner that lasted 40 minutes and came back looking like a man who has been doing math that doesn't add up the way he needs it to. He found Sarah in the sitting room with Marco asleep on her chest and a medical journal open in her lap that she wasn't reading. "Callow is moving faster than I expected," he said quietly so as not to wake the baby. "He's reached out to 2 of my senior men, not with threats, with offers. Are they going to take them? I don't know yet." He sat down in the chair across from her. "That's the honest answer. Loyalty in this world it's a practical thing, not a sentimental one. If they think he's the stronger position, they'll go." "And are you," he looked at her, "am I what? The stronger position?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I'm trying to get out," he said finally. "Men who are getting out are not usually considered the stronger position." "But you're not getting out because you're losing," she said carefully. "You're getting out because you chose to. That's different. That's harder, and that takes more strength, not less." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't read at all. "I know you're not asking for my opinion on your business," she said. No," he said quietly. "I wasn't, but I'm listening to it anyway." Marco sighed in his sleep, and his tiny fingers spread open and then curled shut again, and both of them looked at him, and the tenderness in the room was so present it was almost painful. "There's something else," Dominic said. She looked up. "One of the men Callow approached, his name is Ricci. He's been with me since before Elena told me something tonight." He paused. "He said Callow isn't just trying to take the family. He said Callow intends to use Marco as leverage, as a public symbol of the old Santoro line continuing under new management." His voice went very flat on the last word. "He wants my son to grow up in this world under his influence, to be the face of legitimacy for everything I've spent 3 years trying to dismantle." The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah looked at the sleeping baby on her chest. This small, perfect, entirely innocent person who had no idea that he had been born into the middle of a war over his own future. "That's not going to happen," she said. She said it quietly and completely, without drama, the way she said things in emergency rooms when she needed people to understand that the situation was serious but containable. "That is not going to happen to him." Dominic looked at her for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "No, it's not." And in the way he said it, the absolute bedrock certainty of it, she understood for the first time the full shape of what she was inside. Not just a nurse in a complicated household, not just a stranger who had done a kind thing on a plane. She was woven into this now, into Marco's story, and Dominic's fight, and the fragile, dangerous thing they were both trying to protect. She pressed her hand gently to Marco's back and felt him breathe. Whatever was coming, she was already in it. 3 days passed in a rhythm that felt almost ordinary, which was the most dangerous kind of ordinary Sarah had ever lived inside. Marco was eating better, not perfectly. He still had moments of resistance, with the bottle still turned his face away, and worked his jaw with an expression of profound personal offense. But the 4 o'clock feedings were smoother, the 2 o'clock less desperate, and twice in 3 days, he had given them a 4-hour stretch of sleep that felt, in the context of everything else happening in that apartment, like an act of profound mercy. Dominic was learning. That was the thing Sarah hadn't fully expected, not just that he was willing, but that he was genuinely rapidly learning. He watched everything she did with the focused attention of a man who absorbs information the way other people breathe. And by the 3rd day, he was handling the burping correctly without being reminded, and had stopped tensing every muscle in his body when Marco cried, which had been making the baby worse. He still wasn't easy with it, but he was getting there. And watching him get there, watching this controlled, dangerous, grief-carrying man learn the specific gentleness of fatherhood in real time, was doing something to Sarah's chest that she was trying not to examine too closely. It was Rosa who said it out loud, because Rosa did not believe in leaving important things unsaid. She said it on the 3rd morning in the kitchen while Dominic was on a call in the other room, and Marco was asleep, and Sarah was standing at the counter with her second coffee, staring at nothing. Rosa came up beside her and said without preamble, "You are not just a nurse anymore in this house." Sarah looked at her. "Rosa, I'm not saying anything inappropriate," the older woman said briskly. "I'm saying what I observe. You have stopped looking at him like a patient's father, and he has stopped looking at you like an employee." She picked up her own cup. "I am not saying this is a problem. I am saying it is a fact, and in this house, facts that are ignored become complications." Sarah was quiet for a moment. "It's been 3 days. "I know how long it's been." Rosa's voice was not unkind. "I also know that grief and proximity, and a child who needs both of you, that is not a small thing. That moves faster than people expect." She looked at Sarah steadily. "I liked Elena very much. I loved her, and I am not trying to replace her with anyone, and I don't think Dominic is either. But I am an old woman, and I have watched this family for 50 years, and I know the difference between a person who is passing through and a person who is becoming part of something." She set down her cup. "You are becoming part of something, whether you intended to or not." Sarah stared at her coffee. She thought about Chloe. She thought about how she had come to New York to be useful, to fill the hollow place in herself with purpose, and how it was working, and how that was both a relief and a terror. She thought about the way Dominic had looked at her last night when Marco had grabbed her finger in his sleep and held on, and the way Dominic's face had done something completely unguarded for just 1 second. "I know," she said quietly. Rosa nodded once, satisfied with the honesty, and changed the subject entirely. It was later that same morning that Ricci came. She had heard the name Dominic's man, the one who had warned him about Callow's intentions for Marco. She had formed a mental picture from context, loyal, experienced, probably older. She was not prepared for the man who came through the elevator, medium height, early 50s, with a face that had been through considerable weather and eyes that moved around a room the way a chess player moves around a board. He looked at Sarah and Marco with an assessment that was thorough and not hostile, but was absolutely not warm. "This is Sarah," Dominic said. His voice carried a quality she was starting to recognize, the specific tone he used when he was establishing something as fact rather than opening it for discussion. Ricci nodded at her. Then he looked at Dominic and said in a voice low enough that Sarah had to concentrate, "We need to talk, alone." "She stays," Dominic said. Ricci's eyes went back to Sarah. Something moved in them. "Dominic." "She stays, Ricci. Say what you came to say." A long pause. Then Ricci sat down and said flatly and without decoration that Callow had made his second move. Not through intermediaries this time. He had called a formal sitting an old tradition, the kind that hadn't been invoked in 15 years, requiring the heads of the 5 allied families to convene and hear his claim against Dominic's leadership. The sitting was in 4 days. Dominic had no legal mechanism to refuse it. Refusing would itself be interpreted as an admission of weakness and would likely cause the 2 men Callow had already approached to switch sides immediately. "And if he goes," Sarah said before she could stop herself, "what does Callow present? What's his argument?" Both men looked at her. Ricci with surprise. Dominic with something that was not surprise. "His argument," Ricci said carefully as if deciding how much to give her, "is that Dominic is compromised. That the death of his wife and the birth of his son have made him sentimental and distracted. That he is trying to dismantle infrastructure that took 3 generations to build based on a promise he made to a woman who is gone." He paused. "And that he has now installed a civilian stranger in his home with his heir, which Callow will present as evidence of either recklessness or desperation." The heir went out of the room. Sarah understood in one cold and complete moment that she was not just a vulnerability in this situation. She was a liability that Callow was planning to put on display. Her presence, the presence of a grieving nurse from Chicago who had fed a stranger's baby on a plane, was going to be used as evidence that Dominic Santoro had lost his judgment. "I can leave," she said. She said it clearly and without self-pity. "If my being here hurts his position, I leave. Today. That's not a complicated decision." "No," Dominic said. His voice was immediate and flat. "Dominic, no." He looked at her, and it was not the careful assessing look from the plane, and it was not the exhausted, grateful look from the first night. It was direct and certain, and entirely without strategy. "You leaving doesn't fix the position. It just loses Marco his stability and proves Callow can dictate my decisions through intimidation. That is worse, not better." "He's right," Ricci said, which seemed to surprise Ricci himself slightly. "Callow already knows she's here. Removing her now reads as panic." Sarah sat with that. "So what does he do about the sitting?" Ricci looked at Dominic. Dominic looked at the table. "He goes," Ricci said. "He goes and he demonstrates that he is not compromised, that he is in control of his house, his heir, and his transition. That what Callow is calling weakness is actually strategy." He paused. "He just has to convince 5 men who have spent their lives reading people that that's true." "Is it true?" Sarah said. Dominic looked up at her. "Are you in control?" she said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. He held her gaze. "I'm getting there," he said, and for reasons she couldn't entirely rationalize, she believed him. The next 4 days were a different kind of intensity. Dominic moved through them with a focused deliberateness that she recognized. It was the same quality she brought to a difficult case, the narrowing of attention onto what could be controlled when everything peripheral was uncertain. He met with Ricci twice daily. He made calls she wasn't privy to and came back from them more settled or less settled in ways she learned to read without asking. He slept in 4-hour increments, which she knew because Marco's schedule had become the apartment's clock, and she could hear in the quality of silence from the other rooms who was awake and who wasn't. He also, in the spaces between all of it, kept showing up for Marco with a consistency that was quietly, devastatingly moving to witness. The 2 a.m. feeding on the second night, she had gotten up first, but he was already in the doorway when she reached the room, and she had made him sit down and hold the bottle himself, walking him through it step by step, and he had sat there at 2 in the morning with his newborn son in his arms, and his dynasty cracking at the edges, and his grief sitting in him like something permanent, and he had fed his son with complete concentration and a carefulness that looked Sarah thought a lot like love, learning its own language. "He's looking at you," she said softly, watching Marco's unfocused gaze fix on Dominic's face. Dominic looked down. He went very still. "Can he see me?" "Not well. Newborns see best at about 8 to 12 inches. But he knows your voice. He's been hearing it since before he was born." She paused. "Talk to him." Dominic looked faintly alarmed. "About what?" "Anything. He doesn't care about the content. He cares about the sound." A silence. Then Dominic said very quietly in Italian something low and continuous. In Marco's expression, previously the universal expression of infants, which is roughly similar to someone doing difficult mental arithmetic, shifted into something that was almost around the edges, peaceful. Sarah looked away and let them have that moment. It was the morning of the sitting that the second threat arrived, and this one was not theater. Sarah was in the East Room with Marco when she heard Dominic's voice change register in the hallway, not louder but tighter, the compression in it that she had learned meant something was wrong, and she came out to find him standing with his phone at his side and Richie in front of him and 2 other men she didn't know flanking the elevator. She looked at his face and said, "What happened?" "Callow's people picked up Dana," Dominic said. "Flat, controlled, the kind of control that takes enormous effort." Sarah's blood went cold. "What do you mean picked up?" "She's not hurt," he said immediately. "She's at a restaurant in Chicago surrounded by Callow's men having a conversation she didn't ask for. My people are watching. They haven't moved yet because moving now escalates." He looked at her directly. "Callow is telling me 2 hours before the sitting that he has access to the people I've said I'll protect." Sarah held Marco against her chest and felt her heart rate do something that a year ago would have sent her to a doctor, and now she recognized as adrenaline moving through a body that knows how to work under pressure. She looked at Dominic. "What does he want?" "For me not to go today, to stand down from the sitting and concede leadership." He paused. "If I don't go, I lose everything. If I go, he keeps the pressure on Dana until he decides the point is made." "How long will he hold her there?" "Until the sitting ends, 2-3 hours. And your people in Chicago, they're outside the restaurant. 4 of them. But they can't go in without making it worse." "Not yet." Sarah made a decision in about 3 seconds, the way she made decisions in trauma-based, fast, clear, based on available information, correctable if wrong. "Call Dana," she said, "right now. Let me talk to her." Dominic looked at her. "Sarah, she's my friend and she's scared and she's alone with strangers in a restaurant. And the most useful thing I can do right now is tell her exactly what's happening so she doesn't panic and do something that escalates it. Call her." He handed her the phone without another word. It rang twice and Dana picked up with a voice that was doing a remarkable job of sounding normal. "Hey, it's me," Sarah said. "Don't react. Don't change your expression. Just listen." A beat. "Okay." Still normal. Dana was a middle school science teacher from the south side of Chicago, and she was sitting in a restaurant surrounded by men she didn't know and holding herself together with both hands, and Sarah loved her fiercely in that moment. "You're going to be fine," Sarah said. "The men outside the restaurant are there to protect you, not the ones inside. You are not in danger as long as you stay calm and don't give them any reason to escalate. Finish your coffee. Be boring. I'll call you again in 2 hours and everything will be over." "Got it," Dana said, and her voice was steady as rock. 2 hours. 2 hours, Sarah said. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Just fix it." A pause. "Is the baby okay?" "The baby is great." "Good." And Dana hung up. Sarah handed the phone back to Dominic. He was watching her with an expression she didn't have time to interpret. "Go to the sitting," she said. "I'll stay with Marco. Richie stays here. You go and you do whatever you need to do, and in 2 hours, Dana goes home and this is over." "It's not that simple." "I know it's not that simple. I'm asking you to go do the complicated part while I do the part I know how to do, which is hold down this end." She met his eyes. "Trust me with him. I know you do. So go." Something in Dominic's face went through several things very quickly. Then he crossed the room, and for 1 second she thought he was going to do something that would make the next 2 hours even more complicated, and instead he put one hand briefly firmly on her shoulder. Not a romantic gesture, something older and more serious than that, the gesture of someone transferring a weight they trust the other person to carry, and then he picked up his jacket and walked to the elevator. He looked back once. 2 hours, she said. He nodded. The elevator closed. The next 2 hours were the longest Sarah had spent since the night Chloe died. She sat with Marco and she called Dana every 20 minutes. And she watched Ricci pace the length of the apartment with his phone in his hand, and she held herself absolutely steady by focusing on the one thing she could control, which was the small, warm, entirely trusting life in her arms. Marco looked up at her from the crook of her elbow with his dark, unfocused gaze. She looked back at him. She thought about Chloe. She thought about how grief was not a thing you got over, but a thing you carried, and how the weight of it changed shape as you walked, and how somewhere in the last 4 days, it had started just slightly to feel less like only loss, and more like something that was making her stronger in the broken places. Like the Japanese concept Dominic had mentioned once briefly, almost accidentally, kintsugi, the gold in the cracks. Her phone rang at the 90-minute mark. Not Dana, Dominic. She answered immediately. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. His voice was different, not relaxed but settled. The voice of a man who has just come through something and is still taking stock. It's over. Callow's claim was denied. 3 of the 5 families voted against it. Ricci's information was better than Callow expected. We came with evidence he didn't know we had. A pause. Dana can go home. Sarah closed her eyes for 1 second. 1 full second of pure relief. Good, she said. That's good. Sarah. He paused. The evidence that turned the vote, it wasn't about the business. It was about Marco. Ricci presented. He stopped. He told them about the plane, about what you did, about a stranger who could have walked away but stayed. He told them that a man who inspires that kind of trust from someone who owes him nothing is not a man who has lost his judgment. Another pause, and his voice was very quiet. 3 family heads voted for me based in part on a nurse from Chicago who fed my son on a plane. She didn't say anything for a moment. I don't know what to do with that, he said. You don't have to do anything with it, she said. Just come home. The word hung between them on the line home, and neither of them addressed it because some things needed to be left where they fell for a little while before you were ready to pick them up. I'll be there in 40 minutes, and he said. She set down the phone, so she looked at Marco. He was making the face that preceded hunger by approximately 4 minutes, and she stood up and went to prepare his bottle and let the normalcy of that, the beautiful, grounding, life-affirming normalcy of a baby who needed to be fed, carry her back from the edge of everything she'd been holding together for the last 2 hours. Ricci appeared in the doorway. He's coming back. 40 minutes, she said. Ricci nodded. He looked at her for a moment with his chess player eyes. You did well, he said. It was clearly not a sentence he said to many people. Elena would have... He stopped. Something crossed his face. You did well, he said again, and left. She stood alone in the kitchen, warming the bottle, and thought about what Rosa had said 3 days ago. You are becoming part of something. She had not argued with it then. She had no argument for it now. The question wasn't whether it was happening. The question was what it meant and what it was going to begin at then, and whether the thing growing in her chest when Dominic walked into a room was something she was going to be wise about or something she was already too far inside to see clearly. Marco began to fuss. She picked him up and held the bottle for him, and he drank with the trusting, focused intensity of a creature who has learned that what he needs will be there when he reaches for it. She hoped with a feeling that was half prayer and half terror that he was right about that. She was still hoping it when she heard the elevator arrive and Dominic's voice in the hallway, and then his footsteps, and then the doorway, where he stopped and stood and looked at the 2 of them in the quiet kitchen light. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything either. Some arrivals were big enough that words would only make them smaller. She just looked at him, and he looked at her, and Marco ate his dinner, and the apartment held all of it. He didn't sleep that night. Not really. Sarah knew because Marco woke at 2:15, and she came out, and Dominic was already in the hallway, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed and his eyes open, staring at nothing with the particular quality of a man whose mind has been running at full speed for so many consecutive hours that sleep has become a theoretical concept rather than a physical possibility. She didn't say anything. She took Marco to the kitchen, prepared the bottle, fed him. Dominic followed and sat at the table and watched, and eventually she set a glass of water in front of him, and he drank it without comment, and they stayed like that, the three of them in the quiet kitchen in the middle of the night for almost an hour. "What are you thinking about?" she said finally. "What comes next?" he said. "With Callow." "With everything." He looked at his hands. "Callow lost the vote today, but that doesn't end it. A man like that doesn't accept a single loss and go home. He recalculates. He finds another angle. He waits." Dominic paused. "I know how he thinks because I was trained by the same people who trained him. Which means I know that today was not a victory. Today was a delay." Sarah looked at him steadily. "Then what do you do with a delay?" "You use it." He looked up. "You move faster than they expect. You do in the next 2 weeks what they think will take you 6 months. He held her gaze. "I have a meeting tomorrow with a federal contact. Someone Elena helped me establish a year ago. I've been slow about it, grieving, telling myself there was time." His jaw tightened. "There isn't time. Callow just showed me that." The air in the room shifted. "A federal contact," Sarah said carefully. "A prosecutor," he said, "Oshran. Organized crime division. Elena's idea originally. She said the only way out that is real and permanent is through a door that nobody can close behind you. She meant legal protection. Cooperation." He said the word with the careful neutralness of a man dismantling a live thing. "I know what that word means in my world. I know what people think of men who do it." But Elena was right. She was right about most things. Sarah watched his face while he said it. She saw the cost of it, not shame exactly, but the weight of choosing something that went against every formation of his life, every code he'd been raised inside, and choosing it anyway because a woman he loved had been right, and he knew it. "Is it dangerous?" she said. "The meeting. Less dangerous than not having it." He looked at Marco, now dozing contentedly against Sarah's arm, milk-drunk and completely at peace. "I need him to grow up free of this, whatever it costs me." Sarah looked at the baby. She thought about what Rosa had said. He has been trying to get out for 3 years. And she thought about how grief could be a reason to stop moving or a reason to move harder. And she thought about Elena, who had been a third-grade teacher and had loved a complicated man and had asked him to be better and had died believing he would be. "She knew you'd do it," Sarah said quietly. "That's why she married you. Not because you were already who she needed you to be. Because she knew you were capable of becoming him." Dominic was very still. "I think you've been carrying the grief and the obligation separately," she said. "Like they're two different weights, but they're the same weight. Every step you take toward what she asked for it's the same as honoring her. It doesn't have to feel like loss and duty at the same time. It can just feel like love." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked away toward the window and she saw his throat move. "You're very direct," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. "Nurses usually are," she said. "Comes from years of telling people things they need to hear before they're ready to hear them." A silence, then very quietly, "Thank you." She didn't answer. She looked down at Marco and smoothed one finger over his cheek and felt the warmth of him and the enormous complicated tenderness of it and let the moment be what it was. The next morning, Rosa found them both asleep in the living room. Dominic in the armchair, head tilted back, finally surrendered to the exhaustion he had been outrunning for days, and Sarah on the sofa with Marco on her chest and one hand still resting on the curve of his back. Rosa stood in the doorway for a long moment and said nothing to either of them. She went quietly to the kitchen and began making breakfast and let them sleep. When Dominic woke up an hour later and walked into the kitchen, Rosa poured his coffee and said without looking at him, "She stayed up with you." "I know." "She didn't have to." "I know that too." Rosa set the cup in front of him. "Don't be slow about the things that matter," she said. "You were slow about Elena in the beginning. You almost lost her because you thought you had more time than you did." She looked at him steadily. "Don't make the same mistake twice." Dominic opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He picked up his coffee. Good, Rosa said and went back to her eggs. The federal meeting happened at noon in an office building in Midtown in a conference room that Dominic's attorney had swept for devices 40 minutes earlier. Sarah knew because Dominic told her matter-of-factly the way he had started telling her things, not because she asked, but because she was the person in his house who was most likely to do something useful with accurate information. He was gone 3 hours. He came back looking like a man who has put down something heavy and is feeling for the first time in years the absence of the weight. It went well, she said. It went honestly, he said, which is the best I could ask for. He sat down at the kitchen table. There will be a process. Months. There are things I have to provide documentation testimony on specific operations. It won't be simple or comfortable. He paused. But the door is open. The protection is real. If I walk through it fully, Marco grows up with a father who is not looking over his shoulder for the rest of his life. Sarah put the kettle on. And Callow. Once the cooperation is formalized, Callow loses his leverage entirely. Everything he was going to use against me becomes evidence against him instead. Dominic's voice was flat and precise. He spent 3 weeks trying to take my world apart. He handed me the tools to dismantle his. She set a cup in front of him. Elena would be proud of you. He wrapped both hands around the cup and looked at it and didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I hope so. She would, Sarah said simply and meant it. The twist came that evening without warning, the way the important things always did. Rosa answered the door of the elevator this time, not a knock, which meant it was someone with the code, and came into the living room with an expression Sarah had not seen on her face before. Not fear, something older and more complicated, something that looked like history arriving in person. The man who followed her in was 65, maybe 70, with white hair and a face that had been handsome once and was now just powerful. He wore his age the way certain men do not. Heavily but authoritatively, as though time had added to him rather than taken. He looked at Dominic with eyes that were the same dark color, and for a single suspended second, the resemblance was so undeniable that Sarah's breath caught. Dominic had gone completely still. "Papa," he said. The word came out like something he hadn't said in a long time, like a door opening that had been sealed shut. The older man, Lorenzo Santoro, who was supposed to be in Sicily, who had been in effective exile from the family for 6 years following a dispute that Ricci had once referenced obliquely and never explained, looked at his son with an expression of such compressed and complicated emotion that Sarah felt she was witnessing something she had no right to witness. She looked down at Marco in her arms and felt very strongly that she should leave the room. She started to stand. Lorenzo's eyes moved to her, then to Marco, and his face, the powerful, controlled, weathered face of a man who had built and maintained a dynasty through sheer force of will, did something she hadn't expected. It broke open. "Is this him?" Lorenzo said. His voice came out rough and unprepared. "Is this Elena's boy?" "His name is Marco," Dominic said. His voice was careful, not cold, but careful. Lorenzo crossed the room in 3 steps and looked at the baby in Sarah's arms, with the expression of a man confronting something that makes all the preceding years recalculate simultaneously. His hand moved, then stopped, and he looked at Dominic with a question in his eyes that was Sarah understood a request for permission. Dominic was silent for 5 full seconds. Then he nodded once. Lorenzo put one large hand very gently on top of Marco's head. Marco blinked up at him with his unfocused, ancient gaze, entirely unmoved by the weight of the moment, and Lorenzo made a sound that was not quite a word in any language. "You came," Dominic said, still careful. "I didn't call you." "Ricci called me," Lorenzo said. He straightened. He looked at his son. "He told me about Callow. He told me about the sitting. He told me—" He paused. "He told me you are getting out, fully, the right way." Something moved in his face. "I came to tell you that I will support it, whatever you need from me, whatever I can do to make the path easier." His voice was steady, but it was costing him. "I came to tell you that your mother would have said the same, and that Elena was right to ask it of you, and you are right to do it even now, especially now." Dominic looked at his father for a long time. Sarah held Marco and breathed and stayed absolutely still, because this was not her moment, but she was inside it, and she was going to honor it with complete attention. 6 years, Dominic said finally. "I know. You weren't here when she was pregnant. You weren't here when she died. His voice was controlled, but something underneath it was not. You weren't here for any of it. I know, Lorenzo said again. He didn't defend it. He didn't explain it. He stood there and took it, which was, Sarah thought, probably the only right thing to do. I needed you, Dominic said, and his voice cracked on the last word in a way that seemed to surprise him. He pressed his mouth closed for a moment. Then I needed you and you weren't here. I know, Lorenzo said for the third time, and this time his voice cracked too. I know, Dominic. I am sorry. I am so sorry. He put his hand on his son's shoulder, and Dominic stood there, rigid for one moment, and then something gave way in him quietly and without drama, the way ice gives way in spring, not all at once, but fundamentally, and he let his father's hand stay there and didn't step back. Sarah looked at Marco. Marco looked at the ceiling. She pressed her lips gently to the top of his head and felt him sigh. The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours, and Sarah took Marco to the East Room and gave them the space to have it. She could hear the voices, not the words, but the rhythm of them, the long silences and the sudden rises and the eventual gradual settling into something quieter and more even. She sat with Mark and fed him his evening bottle and sang him the song she had sung to Chloe in the NICU, the one she had not been able to sing out loud in 6 months, and found that it came out steady and whole, and that it didn't only hurt anymore. It hurt, and it also felt around the edges like healing. When she came back out, Lorenzo was sitting across from Dominic with 2 glasses between them, and both of them had the particular look of men who have said difficult true things and survived saying them. Lorenzo looked at Sarah and Marco and said, "My grandson likes you. He likes anyone who feeds him reliably," Sarah said. Lorenzo almost smiled. "That is a Santoro trait." Dominic looked at her from across the room. She looked back. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. It was Rosa who finally said what the room had been holding for days. She came out of the kitchen, dried her hands on a dish towel, looked at Sarah with her sharp, certain eyes and said, "You were going back to Chicago." "I was," Sarah said. And now the room went quiet. Lorenzo looked at his glass. Dominic looked at Sarah. Marco in her arms made a small sound that might have been an opinion. Sarah had thought about this. She had been thinking about it for days in the spaces between feedings and crises and 2 a.m. kitchen conversations. She had turned it over and examined it from every angle the way she examined a situation in a trauma bay. What do I know? What do I need? What is the right thing? What is the true thing? She knew she had come here for Marco. She knew that was still true. She also knew that what Rosa had said 4 days ago was still true. She was no longer just a nurse in this house, and pretending otherwise was a lie she wasn't willing to tell. She had lost a child and walked into a life that needed her and let herself be needed, and somewhere in the doing of that, she had started piece by piece to come back to herself. Not the self from before Chloe. A new self made of the same material, but put together differently, the cracks filled with something that held. She looked at Dominic. He was watching her with those dark eyes that she now knew were not burned out. They had just been waiting for something worth lighting for. "Marco needs consistency," she said carefully. "He's just starting to stabilize. Pulling that support now would set back everything we've built." She paused. "So I'm staying, for as long as he needs me." Another pause smaller. "For as long as I'm needed here." Dominic held her gaze for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You will always be needed here." The words landed and stayed, and neither of them looked away. Lorenzo picked up his glass and looked at Rosa and said in Italian something that made Rosa press her lips together and look at the ceiling with the expression of a woman trying not to be visibly pleased with how things have turned out. She failed. Slightly. That night, after Lorenzo had been settled into the guest room and Rosa had gone to bed and the apartment had found its late-night quiet, Dominic and Sarah sat at the kitchen table with tea. Neither of them was really drinking, and Marco asleep in the bassinet between them, and the whole of it, the plane, the crying, the cold dark of the first night, Callow's theater, Dana in the restaurant, the federal office, Lorenzo at the door, all of it felt like it had been moving toward exactly this. This kitchen, this table, this child breathing quietly between 2 people who had both lost something irreplaceable and found in each other's proximity something they hadn't known they were still capable of. "I need to tell you something," Dominic said. She looked at him. "When you offered to help him on the plane," he said, "I thought you were either the most genuine person I'd ever met or the most dangerous. I had never met anyone who was both at the same time. He looked at the table. I have spent a great deal of my life in rooms full of people performing versions of themselves for strategic purposes. I had forgotten that some people are simply who they are, completely and without apology. He looked up. You are who you are, Sarah Mitchell. Every hour of every day I have known you. That is the rarest thing I have ever encountered. She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something she didn't try to manage. I'm not asking you for anything, he said. I want to be clear about that. I know what you came here for. I know this is Marco's story, and I'm not trying to write you into a different one without your consent. He paused. I'm just telling you what I see, because you deserve to be seen. Sarah looked at him for a long time. Then she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and his hand turned under hers immediately, instinctively, and held on. I see you too, she said quietly. I see who you're trying to become. And I think Elena was right. I think you're going to get there. She squeezed his hand once. And I think Chloe would have liked Marco very much. He pressed her hand back firm and warm and sure. Marco sighed in his bassinet, profoundly unconcerned with the enormity of the moment, and slept on. 3 weeks later, Dana flew in from Chicago and stood in the kitchen door and looked at Sarah holding Marco, and then at Dominic across the table, and then back at Sarah with an expression that contained an entire conversation's worth of best friend communication in under 4 seconds. Then she said, Okay, yeah, I see it. She put down her bag. Someone better make me coffee and explain everything from the beginning. Dominic stood and put the kettle on without being asked, which Dana registered with one raised eyebrow, directed at Sarah, and Sarah pressed her face briefly into Marco's hair to hide her expression. There was no clean ending to the story. They were inside. The cooperation with the federal prosecutor would take months. The untangling of 3 generations of obligation would be slow and painstaking and occasionally frightening. And Calla was still out there calculating, waiting for a new angle that Dominic and Ricci were already 3 steps ahead of. The grief was still there too for both of them. Elena's absence, a permanent shape in the apartment. Chloe's memory, a permanent shape in Sarah's chest. And grief doesn't resolve, it only changes form. And they both knew that. But Marco was eating. Marco was sleeping in 4-hour stretches. Marco looked at his father's face now, with the focused, solemn attention of a person who knows he is loved, and reached for Sarah's voice, the way a plant reaches for light, instinctively, entirely without doubt. And that was the thing. That was the whole of it, finally distilled to its true shape. On a plane over the Atlantic, a baby had cried, and a woman who had learned that love does not require a biological claim had answered. And a man who had forgotten that strength and tenderness were not opposites had let her in. And none of them, not Dominic, not Sarah, not Marco, would ever again be the person they had been before that cry broke the silence. They were something else now. Something that had been built from loss and need and the specific courage of 2 people who had every reason to close themselves off, choosing against all available evidence to remain open. That choice, made 40,000 feet above the ocean on an ordinary night, turned out to be the most important thing any of them had ever done. And they would spend the rest of their lives being grateful for the cry that started it.